So, the State of Resourcing Report, what is it? We've identified 7 key component factors that make up effective resourcing, and you can see what those factors there are on the screen. And we went out and we engaged with over 150 leading organisations in Ireland across many different sectors, banking, finance, professional services, life sciences, construction, engineering, to name but a few. And we talked to organisations both in the public and private sectors, so we've got a very rounded kind of picture, if you like. And we asked people to look at the importance of these 7 component factors and then assess how they delivered against those components. So what I'll do now is I'll go through each of those 7 factors and I'll just draw out what we're doing well and perhaps things to focus on. So we look at prediction and planning. This is kind of where it starts. This is, if you like, knowing what sort of skills and talent you need to bring into the organisation and then knowing how and when to get them on board. And thankfully, we all seem to have a pretty good idea of the skills that our organisations require to deliver their goals and strategic objectives. I think without that, it would be a pretty Herculean task. So we know what sort of people we want, but when it came to planning tools to figure out how to bring those people in, when to bring them in, this is where we fell down. And I think this is indicative of this shift in dynamic. If you think that for about 8 years, most organisations, strategy around resourcing wasn't something you needed really to think about because jobs were at a premium. People in most disciplines were relatively easy to find, and sourcing strategy could be just simply sticking a job on a job board, putting the word out amongst your network, calling a recruitment company, and then you could have 3 qualified candidates pitching up the next day. So you didn't have to think long term about things like talent pipelining, use of different social channels, how you use technology. Those things didn't really factor. It was a much more of a reactive dynamic. Now that the market has changed and organisations need to be much more proactive, this is where they seem to be falling down. We conducted an interesting exercise in Australia quite recently where we took a software developer's CV and we sent out this CV to a large number of organisations, and to half the organisations we put a female name on top of the CV, and to the other half we put a male name on top of the CV. And not surprisingly, and it's kind of disappointing that it wasn't surprising, the bloke got twice as many interview offers as the lady. So this kind of confirms what we probably all know, that there is unconscious bias at play. And referring to VMware, they seem to have tackled this, and they've got a proactive program to tackle unconscious bias. So it's not just about how we're finding people, it's then how we're dealing with them when they get into the kind of pipeline, and are we ensuring that we've got open minds, we're challenging the status quo within our organizations, challenging line managers and recruiters to really make sure they are looking at the full capabilities of people and not just adopting their unconscious bias in the recruitment process. Now, this was a very interesting one, and this was the one component, if you like, where there wasn't a lot of good news. And it's about brand, and everybody recognised, and I think it was the single biggest factor that I think 90% of people said this is really, really important. A strong employer brand is important, but across the board, nobody was really delivering against the importance of this employer brand. And this is about recognising that recruitment is a two-way process. It's about recognising that there's now a new dynamic at play where candidates have choice, but it's perhaps not having adapted to that and still believing that you as the employer are in the driving seat and can kind of call the shots. And we see this happening at work all the time. It's immensely frustrating. You work long and hard to find people to put into the recruitment pipeline, and then it takes forever to get them across the line because you've got maybe people in the organisation slow to respond. It's taking 2 or 3 weeks to go from a first to a second interview, another 3 or 4 weeks to get to an offer stage, and people are dropping out, and employers who have kind of wised up and are sharper and are quicker are dealing with that better. And this is impacting on organisations' employment brand, if you like. The time was when, if you had an established brand, if you people consumed your products, used your services, that maybe was enough to draw people towards your organization. But now I think organizations have distinct kind of consumer brands and employment brands, and you need to mind your employment brand in the same way that you mind your consumer brand. There are a plethora of sites out there at the moment. We've all heard of things like Rate My Teacher and Rate My Boss. There's sites like Glassdoor and Indeed, where you get this unsolicited but very public feedback from both current and ex-employees about what it's like to work in your organization. And if you're ignoring that, I think you're missing a trick, because candidates don't ignore it. When they are researching what kind of organizations they want to work for, they don't just look at your website, they don't just talk to people like us, they go online, they see what people are saying on Glassdoor, what people are saying on Indeed, and they take that into account. And if you're not curating that, if you're not managing that employment brand, you may well find that people just aren't coming to you because of things other people are saying. So I think that's something that people recognize is really important these days, but maybe haven't quite grasped how to deal with it. Then looking at assessment methodology. So once we've found the people, they've come in through the pipeline, we're now assessing whether or not they're the right fit for our organization. And again, I would say there's some kind of positive legacies of the kind of recessionary times, in that our use of assessment tools seems to be pretty robust. We're good at using competency-based interview techniques, we're good at using assessment centers, psychometric tests, etc. The different tools and techniques that we can use to make sure people are both the right skills fit for our organization and the right cultural fit for our organization. But then when it comes to the actual process that we're adopting, it's going back to what I was saying just a moment ago, we're falling down again. We're taking too long. We're not recognizing that actually it's the candidate in the driving seat now. The candidates are going to have choice. They're going to have, if they're coming to see you, they're probably going to see 3 or 4 other companies as well. And if you're just concentrating on your internal processes and not minding the candidate's process, you could well lose out. So then looking at what happens when people join an organization. Again, pre-employment screening, compliance checks, ID checks, people are who they say they are, they can do what they say they can do. We're good at that, we've got robust processes in place, and generally speaking we do okay when it comes to that. But what's not so good is the experience when people join organizations. And again, this is, we're not necessarily putting the individual at the heart of that process. We asked people whether they're using technology to track their recruitment process, and by and large, people were. Now, the sort of technologies there are, off-the-shelf platforms you can buy, things like Avature, PeopleFluent, there's a whole host of them that people can use as effective ATS systems. But what organizations didn't seem to have cracked was both marrying up those ATS platforms with sourcing strategies. So quite often people were coming into the ATS platform, but they didn't know kind of how they were arriving there. And then linking up that ATS platform with their internal finance and HR systems, so that you've got a kind of cradle-to-grave picture of the whole process, and not just a recruitment process, but then the effectiveness of those people when they joined. So there was a bit of a, yes, we're good at seeing where people are. This guy's at second interview, this guy's, CV stage, et cetera, but you don't get that holistic picture of, well, actually, we find that people from this source who are dealt with in this way during the process become our most effective employees. So there's a kind of disconnect there between the use of ATS platforms and how they marry up with other platforms that you use within your businesses. And that's kind of reflected in the final slide here around metrics and measurement. Again, people have the systems and processes. They know who works for them, where they are, what they do, how well they do it, how much they get paid, when they're on leave, etc. But again, they maybe haven't married that up to their sourcing data to get that all-round review. So you haven't got effective MI around not just the individual's performance, but perhaps more importantly here, you haven't got effective MI around the performance of your process. Data-driven decisions are now becoming the norm in most facets of business. HR professionals have or should have the capability to have lots of data in front of them to make decisions, to fine-tune their processes, to feed back into the business about what they need to do differently. But are we actually using that data in the most kind of scientific and insightful way to ensure the effectiveness of our HR and recruitment processes?